Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. And thanks so much to my team for making sure that people can get in. All right, I see a few more folks joining. Welcome, welcome. I am Sam Diaz, the Executive Director here at 1000 Friends of Oregon. And I just want to welcome you to one of our first members only behind the scenes updates on the exciting and important work that our team is leading in partnership with all of you to make sure that our land use planning program remains effective, remains inclusive, and remains a tool for us to be able to tackle problems together to improve our communities. We're excited to launch this series with this look at Senate Bill 762, Oregon's comprehensive approach to wildfire preparedness and resiliency. We're really focused on implementation of this, right? So this is an opportunity for rulemaking, for on the ground projects, and you'll hear more about that. And so we're really even though it has legislation in the title, we're really talking about the executive branch in our state agencies and at the local level. It's great to see so many familiar names, from longtime supporters to our newest members. It's really, really great and inspiring to connect with you all on this. As you know, 1000 Friends has worked alongside our members to defend and enhance Oregon's unique land use planning system for nearly 50 years. And sometimes people ask, and I got a few emails about this, of why is 1000 Friends involved in the wildfire conversation? And so our answer is simple, and you will hear more about it. But the wildfire is a land use issue. We have a lot of great tools in our land use planning program already, and we have the opportunity to add more tools in our land use planning program so that we have safer and healthier communities across our state. There's some Oregon towns and cities are located in wildfire prone areas. And thanks to our state's land use planning program, Oregon has grown into the wildland urban interface, which we'll hear more about, far less than other places when we look to other states. Before I describe our program today, I want to thank you all for your support for 1000 Friends. And I especially want to thank partners who have dedicated the capacity for our team to be able to take this on. We would not be able to have this opportunity in our state without you all. So I really want to thank you on behalf of the team here. First, we have two speakers, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. We'll want to hear from you about this as well. And our two speakers are Mary Kyle McCurdy and Doug Grafe. So I really want to thank them for being here with us and for also leading the incredible work across the state to help us maneuver through what really can be depressing and terrifying data. So I really want to thank them for their leadership on this. Mary Kyle, I'm sure, is a familiar face and a familiar name to many of you. She has been affiliated with 1000 Friends for over 30 years. She is our deputy director and oversees all of our program work. We have great communities programs, so making sure our cities and towns are thriving, and our working lands program, so defending our family farms and forests and making sure that we have productive and thriving natural and working lands. So I want to turn it over to her to kick us off and to describe a bit more about how 1000 Friends got into this work.
Thank you, Sam, and good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us. It really is great to see so many of you that I've seen throughout this wildfire work that we've been doing. But it has come up, why is 1000 Friends of Oregon focused on wildfire preparedness and resiliency? And we have been focused on the role that the land use planning program has and should continue to play in making Oregon wildfire resilient and prepared. We started in 2018, a little bit before that, but basically in 2018, with publication of our report titled A New Vision for Wildfire Planning, a report on land use and wildfires, which you can find on our website. It's a very comprehensive report of the role that land use can and should play in making Oregon and other states more wildfire resilient. As described in that report, thanks to two main features of Oregon's land use planning program, urban growth boundaries and protection of farm and forest land, Oregon has experienced less loss of life and homes from wildfires than other Western states. How have we done that? First, Oregon has fewer structures in the wildland urban interface, or the WUI, than most Western states, thanks to urban growth boundaries. And second, Oregon does not have the sprawling development patterns of other states. Sprawl increases wildfire risk in several ways. It increases driving and thus greenhouse gas emissions and climate change that leads to the drying of forests and land. Sprawl brings more people and structures into the wildland urban face, and people cause most wildfires, mostly inadvertently, but that is the cause of most wildfires. And sprawl paves over natural and working lands, meaning they lose their carbon sequestration capacity and wildfire resiliency. But we are at risk of losing this goose that laid a golden egg. While Oregon has a relatively low percentage of homes and people in the WUI, it has a fairly high growth rate of new homes and new people in the WUI. A recent US Forest Service study found that over a third of all homes in Oregon are built in the WUI, and 80% of seasonal or vacation homes in Oregon have been built in the WUI. The 1000 Friends Wildfire Report made several land use recommendations for legislative and agency actions, including first, map wildfire risks statewide, to limit development in high wildfire risk areas to structures that need to be there, such as for farming and ranching, and three, mitigate risks to existing and future developments where that development cannot be avoided altogether. And therefore, 1000 Friends has engaged in several state-level efforts over the past few years, eventually culminating in the passage of Senate Bill 762 in 2021, the Comprehensive Wildfire Preparedness and Resiliency Bill. We are honored to now be serving on the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council, and we are serving and have served on several of the rules advisory committees that have resulted from 762. Those are translating that legislation into rules and investment policies and guidance for implementing 762 at the local level. The land use planning program has important tools to mitigate wildfire risk, build in preparedness, and help Oregonians learn to live with this natural part of our Western ecosystem. You're going to hear a lot more about the details of that implementation from Doug in a moment. But first, back to Sam for that introduction.
Thanks so much, Mary Kyle. And just a reminder to folks, if you do have questions, whether they're clarifying or you'd like to tee up for the Q&A after our speakers, please put them into the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen, and we'll make sure that we queue them up in time. So I'll do my best to introduce Doug, who joined the governor's office last fall from the Oregon Department of Forestry. And he worked there for 17 years in a variety of positions: stewardship forester, the Toledo unit forest manager, the fire operations manager, deputy chief of fire protection, and chief of fire protection. And before Oregon Department of Forestry, held positions as a city forester at the city of Albany, consulting utility forester for PG&E in California, and a harvest inspector for the U.S. Forest Service, Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit, and assistant forester for Georgia Pacific Corporation in Florida. And I just, suffice to say, we are extremely lucky to have someone with such rich experience from across the nation helping steer Oregon's strategy. And I really want to acknowledge the collaborative approach and the transparency that Doug brings to the position and to this work. So really appreciate you as a leader, Doug, here in Oregon. And thanks so much for joining us. I'll turn it over to you now.
Well, that is a tremendous introduction. I really appreciate those kind words. It is an absolute honor to be in service to Oregonians and to have oversight on this investment, Senate Bill 762. Let me pause and just do a tech check with you. How am I coming in right now?
Sound great. Sound clear to me.
Great. Thank you, Sam. I'm a little bit of a disadvantage today. I am traveling. I'm in Spokane. I'm meeting with departments of, agriculture and interior, and departments as we look at infrastructure investments. So I'm learning about how federal investments are going to help what Oregon has accomplished with the passage of Senate Bill 762 to advance fire protection. And it's a great pleasure to join you for lunch today as I take a moment with my friends back here in Oregon. And I'm lingering on a comment I heard as to why 1,000 friends would engage. And we'll definitely speak to specific programs around land management and how that impacts wildfire in this presentation. But I would just emphasize right at the front end, this matters to every Oregonian. Wildfire is no longer an issue that's out in the wilderness, out in the woods, that does not have impact to every aspect of our livability in the West. And we have a tremendous workload ahead of us. And the only way we in Oregon are going to be successful and accomplish these objectives to advance fire protection and mitigate the catastrophic risk of wildfire, which we're all facing, is to do that together. So those words of accountability and transparency, Sam, that you just highlighted on the front end, I really appreciate that observation, because that's where I want to lead from, to ensure that Oregon has a strong system to be effective, to really take care of the treasures that we have in this state, our natural resources, our communities, and the people. And as you look at this presentation, we will walk through why it's so critically important. We'll look at a little some of the trends relative to wildfire in the state, and it's reflective across the West, and that continues to rise. We'll talk about what we've done here in Oregon, and then I'll close with a little, if you will, a reality check of what it looks like in the future relative to wildfire, and why now's the time, or yesterday was the time to act, and how 50 years ago Oregonians did act with the land use laws that have set us up perhaps in a different place than other states around this relative to wildland urban interface. And it's one of the places that isn't as acknowledged in the conversation of wildfire protection as well as it could be. So I really appreciate the invite, and we'll tie all that together. So if we start with the next slide, please. So as you consider wildfire trends in Oregon, and we'll look at the last 3 decades of wildfire perimeters across all lands in the state of Oregon. On an annual basis in the late 90s, we were burning about 170,000 acres on an annual basis. The next decade, you'll see we close to doubled that to 330,000 acres roughly, and then another doubling to 660,000 acres on an annual basis. And all indicators and modeling relative to climate suggest that that's the trajectory we're on. And what's really critical about this reality is learning to live with fire and really shifting the dynamic of wildfire from catastrophic in nature, i.e., consuming our treasured natural resources and the loss of communities and life that we've experienced here in Oregon, and more dramatically in California. It's going to take a comprehensive approach, and you'll see that we've done that here in Oregon and feel like we're on a good trajectory. But this is our reality. This is the trend we've seen, and pitches tell 1,000 words. So we'll walk through the fire perimeters across the state with the next slide. This was 2 decades ago. And you can see this is where we've had fire across much of the landscape in the range in southeast Oregon. Much of eastern Oregon is where we would experience those large fires, deep in the canyon lands of the Snake in southwest Oregon. This map is really powerful, and you have a PDF of this to share with the group, and please do. And if there's any follow-up questions beyond the seminar, I'd be happy to take those. But you can see largely an east side issue relative to large fires, and you can see where we're having those fires, what jurisdictional landscapes there are across those perimeters. Next decade, next slide, you'll see an increase both in concentration and size of fires, and you start to see an era of mega fires, which is fires over 500,000 acres. Southwest there, the Biscuit Fire was one of those mega fires we're starting to see across the landscape, but certainly seeing more fire, and then the size of fires is increasing, and then to a dramatic scale in the next slide, which is the current decade. We can see the results of reburns of those mega fires. So once a fire does hit, we can certainly expect reburn depending on the condition, ecological condition and health of that landscape. Fires will return. So there's a lot to learn from our history as we evolve. Where do we want to be as a state to live with wildfire? Because it is not going away. But transitioning that from catastrophic in nature to more natural fire on the landscape, which this landscape has evolved for hundreds of thousands of years, and tribal nations for thousands of years before current governments have lived with and utilized fire in the natural environment. How do we learn from this experience to move forward? So what Oregon did, consistent with many other states. Next slide. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop for a pause before I go to where we move forward. I do want to make note of the true cost of wildfire, just to put a finer point on the challenges we have currently and ahead of us. We often think of the cost of wildfire on the right side of the slide, suppression costs, because those dollars we're spending to suppress wildfire, and you can see the last decade, about 17 million, and this current decade, 85 million. So we've had a 5x increase in suppression costs. But in reality, and many studies have shown, the true cost of wildfire and those larger perimeters and the catastrophic nature of those wildfires that we're seeing in Oregon is far beyond suppression costs. Social, economic, environmental implications, losses of infrastructure, cultural resources, tourism, smoke and health impacts, transportation, power interruptions, watersheds, wildlife habitat, timber, agriculture, recreation. Following the 2020 fire season, 5006 House bill was passed with $480 million for recovery. Studies across the nation show, the average, generally speaking, 10 times the cost of suppression is standard what you can expect for true cost of fire, but it ranges from 2 times to 50 times the cost of suppression. So to think we're in the billions of dollar range for losses is realistic. And we're really starting to see that as we pass bills like House Bill 5006 on just the recovery components and not the other losses that cannot be recovered listed above. So really wanted to just spend a moment before we talk about why we need these investments to adapt a wildfire strategy for Oregon that's sustainable into the future. Next slide, please. So what have we done in Oregon And you can see we took action with the Governor's Council on wildfire response in 2019, 37 recommendations consistent with the National Cohesive Strategy, adequate response, resilient landscapes, and fire adapted communities are the tenets for that national strategy. In 2021, Senate Bill 762 was passed with $195 million investment to advance fire protection in Oregon. And you can see those dollars towards readiness and response, towards fire adapted communities, and then the landscape resiliency. I have a slide, I'll get in more about that, but that's essentially how we change the characteristics of wildfire, how it acts on the landscape, moving it from catastrophic in nature at the canopy of the forest down into the ground level where it's more natural and normal to see fire on the landscapes. And we'll speak more on that. Next slide. The oversight of Senate Bill 762, two organizations were created. Or not, well, organizations, positions was my position, the Wildfire Programs Director, and then 11 agencies with authority and implementation responsibilities to advance fire protection and programs that support the state to live with fire. You can see those listed here. I have a slide that will talk about the Department of Land Conservation and Development, where is Thousand Friends intersection on land use largely lies. And on the right side of the slide, you can see the Wildfire Programs Advisory Council, which I really appreciate, because as you can begin to absorb, and you all have certainly lived with wildfire in the past, so you understand its implications. I don't want to do this work alone personally. When I saw that the council was created by the legislature and appointed by the legislature, I thought this is a job I'd be very much interested in doing, knowing that I would have the added value of perspective, and the council will bring perspective and necessary guidance to the state to advance fire protection in Oregon, support oversight and implementation of 762. So really excited about that. And Thousand Friends has one of your own on the council, Mary Kyle, is on that council, appointed by the president, Speaker of the House, and Senate President. So really pleased to have that organization to coordinate with as we tackle significant questions for Oregon. We'll have quarterly meetings with the council, and they have an annual report to the legislature. So they'll be able to put their thoughts on paper and have great influence to the conversation. And on a daily basis, I'm speaking with members of the council. Next slide, please. So a little more specifics on the programs, and it's a wide range of effort here on readiness and response. The Department of Forestry, largest fire department essentially in the states. It protects 16 million acres to forest and grazing lands, added capacity on the typical resources you would expect: aviation and wildfire engines and resources and equipment. State Fire Marshal, which supports over 300 of our local fire departments. Clear recognition, which is largely volunteer-based, needed added capacity because we're asking more and more of our local fire departments as fire enters our communities, both rural and urban, frankly, what we've experienced and what we have to prepare for. Public Utility Commission is engaged with advanced planning. Office of Emergency Management with emergency planning, certainly in their wheelhouse, but more effort and energy and focus on wildfire. Baseline protection standards across the state with ODF and wildfire risk mapping with Oregon State University, and detection cameras so we can spot those fires early before they really get a foothold and get large and catastrophic. On the fire adapted community side, $60 million. OSFM leading the defensible space standards. So we're that 100 feet around the structure, and how we protect that structure by providing an opportunity for firefighters to respond safely and defend those structures. Community risk reduction program, really thinking strategically around communities, and every community is different and has different environments around it. So local planning, Department of Consumer Business Services with some hardening of homes standards to advance our construction formula around our structures to bring them more resilient to the wildfire embers that largely what consumes homes. Land use recommendations, I have a slide that will speak to that. Community smoke response plans. So what I really appreciate about Oregon, and I work with my peers around the nation, is we're taking aggressive action, not just in the defensible space and the hardening of homes. That's what we typically talk about in terms of readying our communities for fire. But on the public health side, is critically important for Oregon with the smoke impacts and vulnerable communities. So advancing smoke response plans, smoke monitoring, public smoke, public spaces where we can have safe spaces in public buildings. So advancing air filtration systems, both in public buildings, but in residential smoke filtration systems. And Higher Education Coordination Commission addressing youth in the workforce and building capacity where we know our workforce needs to evolve to this rising risk that's ahead of us and the workload ahead of us. So I think really smart legislation, broad perspective to build programs out to address the issues. Resilient landscapes, I do have a slide that specifically really details that, so I'll hold off with that, but that's about reducing the catastrophic risk of wildfire. It's fire behavior by treating landscapes broadly across the state and the use of prescribed fire. Next slide, please. So this is that resilient landscapes. And when I say resilient landscapes, again, I go back to a picture because it tells 1,000 words. This is the Bootleg fire on Klamath Tribe, tribal ground. Total fire acres was 413,000 acres burned last summer. Significant fire. And as you fly over this landscape, and this drone graphic shows us, you can see one very green spot in the middle of the fire sky. And the reason this landscape survived here is because we did landscape resiliency treatments, specifically thinning the forest trees and prescribed fire to follow that treatment of mechanical and hand thinning across this landscape. And that puts the landscape, this forested landscape, in a more resilient posture to have fire come across it, not burn up the trees and the canopy, the high reaches of the trees, but the fire did move across this, but at the ground level, not consuming the trees, cleaned up fuels at the base of the trees, and really puts this landscape, this couple hundred acres, in a 413,000 acre footprint on landscape in a good position. This landscape, this couple hundred acres, is resilient to large catastrophic wildfire. And I can only dream of a day where we would have much of this landscape to the scale we need. So we're not talking about 500,000 acre fires, catastrophic nature, consuming our treasured natural resources and communities along the way. So this is what resilient landscape looks like. And we've invested $25 million in this work to restore ecological functions, reduce smoke issues by increasing prescribed fire at the right time, where we can manage the smoke and get it up and out of the atmosphere and not settling into our communities. So all that is tied together. I need more of this. That's partly why I'm in Spokane, looking at the infrastructure investments. There's about $3.4 billion nationally invested in landscape resiliency. So that's what my day is focused in today. And I really appreciate, we really need to change the dial, move the dial on this, because this is what drives catastrophic wildfire. And this is a forested example, but there's range examples also. Next slide. So specific to land use, I mentioned really the value on why 1,000 Friends is significant. in this conversation is because the land use work we did many years ago, but as we consider moving forward, what's the right land use discussion needed to think about our rules and how we build communities in the reality of increased fire on the landscape. And it is our reality. So, entrusted with the Department of Land Conservation Development, I've hired a new wildfire planner. So, step one, some expertise. I work with Susan closely. And the department's to report to the legislature on recommended updates to land use planning, local comprehensive plans and zoning codes, incorporating wildfire in the conversation, because it's an evolving risk in terms of natural hazards that was not fully contemplated. I would say the land use regulations from 50 plus years ago, we're benefiting from those impacts and those rules, but I don't know that it was necessarily intentional relative to preserving from catastrophic wildfire. That just wasn't in our scope of reality. So now revisiting that conversation, given the reality of what we have on the landscape with fire, is an important step, and the law called for that effort. The report's due in October 2022, and as you would expect, DLCD's doing their due diligence, reaching out with listening sessions. There's their website and the dates that they have moving forward: April 6th and 7th, 12th and 13th, stakeholder group meetings May through August, and they have presentations to their commission July and September. So that's certainly the place to intersect and think about land use and the good work we did many decades ago. How do we think about that to set up the state for the next couple of decades, right? So great work here, and just a finer point as to why this matters to Thousand Friends, specifically to your work, but then largely as simply as Oregonians living in this reality of increased fire. Next slide, please. So another task I have in this Wildfire Programs Director position is to report to the legislature on a bi-monthly, every 2 months, and the governor relative to where are we going next. So oversight on the current Senate Bill 762 implementation across those 11 agencies, but what else do we need to pick up? And from a cursory review of the Governor's Wildfire Council recommendations, 37 of them, these are the areas that jump out to me initially, and these will evolve with guidance from the council, where I see future advancements and efforts that we need to address, and that's sustained program funding. This cannot be a one and done program evolution. Wildfire is not going away. We need to adjust and learn where our investments work the best, and we'll do that work, and the council will help with that in their report. I think emergency fire funding fix, we're really asking OSFM and ODF to carry debt before we receive federal funding from FEMA, and those agencies simply aren't built to carry that financial debt upwards of $50 to $80 million. So they're certainly not a bank and structured that way. So we have some challenges to fix there, and those agencies are considering that now. Prescribed fire liability. So one of the limitations to putting prescribed fire on the ground is the liability factor. Certainly the smoke is one that we all think about front and center, but there's the liability question there. And the DCBS is actually working on this with a correlated bill that asks them to study the liability. So we'll see that report this year. Wildfire prevention laws, and this is just common sense. Asking ourselves, our laws germane to the reality that we're facing today. So Department of Forestry will be looking at that through the Board of Forestry. So they're beginning those conversations. The property insurance affordability is a big one. We want to insure homes, right? And we're seeing challenges in California with complete losses in homes and communities. insurance increasing, and in some places potentially not there. And we need to get ahead of that. It's not hitting Oregon at this time, but we'll get ahead of that with the insurance commissioner and DCBS. Durable recovery programs, just simply a reality. Annually, we're doing recovery now, just as we are doing fire response and readiness. And that's simply a reality of the business, as we're burning on average 650,000 acres, and that's going to continue. Leveraging partnerships is the obvious piece. And again, well, I'm in Spokane today, working with federal partners and seeing how we can amplify the landowner general fund dollars that were just allocated in Senate Bill 762 with federal dollars, and think about durable partnerships in funding to make this work. Next slide, please, and we'll close out. With that, we'll open discussion here in a minute, but I just wanted to really plant the seed for the reality of this fire season. This is the worst prediction I've seen in my tenure. And I've been through some tough fire seasons. We all have been through some tough fire seasons here in Oregon. And an exceptional drought, pretty much ranging from Klamath, Lake counties, where we burned one fire, 413,000 acres with the Boot Lake fire, all the way up to our Washington border, almost into that wheat country, is not something we've seen. And the risk there in Central Oregon is absolutely concerning, particularly where we have our population densities there. So this map is not encouraging, but once again, just simply puts a finer point why Oregon has acted, why we need all Oregonians engaged in this conversation and leading ourselves to a better place. And we'll need 1,000 friends at the table. So I'm proud to be here. I'm glad I could join you for lunch today. Wish we could see in person, so I'm not talking to my phone. But I really genuinely appreciate the invite and honored to join. And that's the last slide, is simply a thank you.
Okay. Yes. Thanks so much, Doug, and Mary Kyle. I want to give a again reminder. Please put your questions into the Q&A. The team can see it, and so we're working through the great list of questions that we have, and we'll try to get to them all with the remaining 20 minutes we have. And I also want to give a shout out to one of our board members who's on the webinar, Carol Whipple, outside of Eugene. Carol is not only an incredible board member, but is also advising as part of advisory committee on Senate Bill 762 implementation, bringing that perspective of what are the connections from the land use planning program to decisions for how we prepare and respond to wildfire. So thank you so much for your service, Carol, on this important work. Okay, so I am going to do my best to try and get through some of these questions, and please keep them coming. And if we can't get to them all, the team will work to get you answers back, so we make sure people don't leave with a question unanswered. There are two questions, looks like focused on conservation corps programs, Doug. That was part of the list for the state agencies and the funding. Do you have recommendations for how communities can apply or get connected with the Conservation Corps grant opportunity?
Yes. So Higher Education Commission created a council to address granting program. $10 million is what was allocated under Senate Bill 762 to higher education to create a conservation corps program. And they've just stood that up, and they do have their commission operating, and they've advertised their grant opportunities to communities and to youth organizations. And they're looking at their first round of grants. So I would direct folks to Doug Denning from Higher Education Coordination Commission, that organization, and he can work through where they're at with their next round of grant programs and how to engage and what those limitations are, etc. And I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you, Doug. We'll include the Doug Denning's contact information in the chat, and then also as follow-up. All right, what a great opportunity for that. Let me turn over to a question about the connection where you talked a lot about the state agency framework here, and we have a question about how it can connect with local planning departments. So let me share the context that we have with the question, because I think it may be helpful. So in this person's experience, county land use primarily focuses on implementing zoning and land use ordinances with respect to new development and uses. There's little to no focus on existing development, quote unquote, yet Senate Bill 762 will be addressing defensible space standards for all tax lots in the WUI zones. Mary Kyle, Doug, how do you see local planning departments transitioning to this added focus on quote unquote existing development?
I can go ahead and start, and Mary Kyle would be interested in your perspective. DLCD, of course, has a planning function, and we walked through that slide, and I would encourage engagement with the listening sessions and the stakeholder group meetings that they're working through to establish. We have that web page, and city and county planners will be engaged with DLCD on that level. Relative to the defensible space standards, State Fire Marshal is beginning their work. They just stood up their rules advisory committee, and they will really build from what the Department of Forestry did to build the map of the wildland urban interface, and they'll learn from that experience and then begin to implement their program, the State Fire Marshal's program, which is defensible space standards at 100 feet around structures. And they'll need to work through operationally what structures within the wildland urban interface and how are we going to apply these standards. So there's certainly an engagement there that the State Fire Marshal will be outreaching to cities and counties and interested parties to really build that program out. And in law, it was explicit to high and extreme classified risk. There are 5 risk classes that we'll see in the map. So the defensible space standards will apply to those specific classifications. And I may not have hit the answer just spot on there. So Mary Kyle, is there anything, if I missed any nuance in the question there, you could add?
I think what you just said last, I'm going to repeat it because I think it's really important. The defensible space standards will apply to areas that are both in the WUI and in the high and extreme wildfire risk areas. So we will be seeing those risk maps by the end of this year, maybe a couple months earlier than the end of this year, and the WUI map as well. So that will be known soon. And the Oregon State Fire Marshal, who I just happened to be talking this morning to one of the deputy fire marshals who's in charge of this program, they lead with education and voluntary compliance. They're going to be doing extensive outreach and communications and public education so that individual property owners, renters, lessees, communities understand the risks and the tools available to implement defensible space around their own structures and communities. While they do have the ability to get to a regulatory place, that's really their last resort. It's really going to be focusing on the voluntary compliance and education. And I'll just reiterate what I think Doug said, that there's investment funding that's included in Senate Bill 762 and other federal dollars and such, and the Conservation Corps, et cetera, to help implement this. And we hope and expect to see communities lining up for those funds. And then again, the DLCD is doing a scoping exercise over the summer and fall to see how does this integrate with land use planning. It's scoping. They will make a report at the end of the year to the legislature.
Okay. Thank you both. I think we may have some other questions on DLCD's effort as well. So we'll work to get Susan Milhauser, who's an attendee, I'll promote her as panelist. As we do that, maybe we'll shift back to the focus on water. Doug, your last slide highlighted this and the exceptional drought that we are facing. Can you describe how water is coming up in your discussions and how state agencies are incorporating, this forecast into decision-making, prioritization? Can you just share a bit more for us on that?
Yeah, a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, right? Drought is one of those drivers for catastrophic wildfire risk, and we're seeing a really strong correlation of where fire is. The larger question on what all agencies and what the state's really doing around drought is outside of my purview of implementation of 762. Drought is just a driving force as to why we need to do our work on the wildfire front. So I'd be careful about trying to go too deep, other than the full recognition that the state has been dealing with drought since 2012 was the first year we saw significant drought enter the state, and we saw counties applying for, or acknowledging drought conditions, and recovery dollars coming in to support all the downstream implications and challenges that drought offers on any variety of topics. But since 2012, we've really been challenged with this. And of interest, in 2012, the drought showed up in Southeast Oregon, and we burned 1 million acres of the range that year. And we quickly invested in advancing fire protection in that region. And I said early at the close of the presentation, 2012, we've just seen an escalation of the drought conditions, and this is the worst I've seen as we're entering into a fire season.
Well, yeah, it's good to have the forecast and the reality check in the state agency work. Appreciate you holding the science up. We'll shift over to mapping. Someone would like a bit more, I think, of a deep dive, as much as you're able to, on the mapping on the WUI and the wildfire risk levels. And Mary Kyle, if you have a perspective on mapping, or maybe if you want to share 1,000 Friends' position as we think about what factors we would like to see in the mapping exercise, that would be a great to share with our members. So Doug?
Okay, so overall, mapping wildfire risk is not a new experience for any Western states, and Oregon, we've certainly been doing this work for many decades, and in close partnership with the science from Pacific Northwest research stations to our own universities, particularly Oregon State University. So it's been a natural fit to really codify it in law that this is the statewide wildfire risk map. We've had a map established for many reasons, obviously, to prioritize investments and workloads and know where our risk is so we can plan accordingly. But this is codifying the work in law and housed in Oregon State University officially with the Oregon Explorer web portal. And anyone now can click on that portal and see the wildfire risk. But in June, so a little clarity, Mary Kyle, at the end of June, OSU and Department of Forestry are required in Senate Bill 762 to complete the map. So we will have an official risk map with 5 classifications, from extreme risk to high risk to moderate to low to no risk. And that's explicit in law. And it was all founded on our realities of what data and science we have behind it, and felt very comfortable that we could produce that work for an official statewide map. So that's the process we're under right now, and should finish that here in midsummer here. Mary Kyle?
Right, thank you. I was just looking that up in the bill, that those are both due by the end of June, both those maps, and how that fits into the land use planning program. As I mentioned earlier, and I don't know if Susan's going to want to contribute any thoughts to this, but DLCD is charged with scoping how to incorporate the wildfire risk map, the WUI map, defensible space standards, and a variety of other things into land use planning. And I just want to mention a few things that I know people are concerned about, but might not be thinking about it. Things like infrastructure. Many communities in the Willamette Valley, for example, their drinking water sources are in the Cascade Mountains, some of which were damaged in recent wildfires. How do we protect those? Are they in a high or extreme wildfire risk category? Evacuation routes. Right now, there's a variety of things that take place in high and extreme. I think we'll find out that they're taking place in high and extreme wildfire risk areas in the WUI. Are those activities or uses that we should continue to allow, or continue to allow under only certain circumstances? Do they have evacuation routes, more than one evacuation route? Are they known? What can we do for education? I think anyone who's going to the Oregon coast sees everywhere signs for tsunami risk and evacuation routes, right? You know, you are aware of those, or you can be fully aware of those if you're on the Oregon coast or if you live on the coast. We don't really have that at all for wildfire risk, and we should have those kinds of preparedness and resiliency built in. Communication systems, infrastructure, evacuation routes, in addition to what uses and activities should we be allowing in the future out in these very risky areas. I'll just say again something I mentioned in my opening comments, that over 90% of wildfires are caused by humans. The most intense wildfires are caused by lightning strikes, as I understand, but most wildfires, small, large, are caused by humans inadvertently for the most part. You know, really may not even know that a spark from your tailpipe has just ignited some dry straw that you have driven over. And those are, you know, a campfire that isn't put out all the way. People vacationing from urban areas in more wilderness or dry areas that aren't really appreciative of not, you know, having a campfire, those sorts of things. So those are the kinds of things that we need to take into account in terms of education and what it means to the land use planning program going forward. Susan, did you want to add anything?
Thanks, Mary Kyle. I think I will add that Doug shared the link on the one slide where you can find more information about the upcoming community listening sessions. And I can also, I think if I can paste that in the chat, I will do that. But these are around the state, focused on different regions. These are virtual listening sessions where we'll have some smaller breakout groups where folks from different counties can talk about more local concerns and issues. And under Senate Bill 762, there was an emphasis at looking at regional differences in terms of our land use recommendations. So that will be important feedback to get back from folks in different parts of the state. And then we also have yet another advisory group that is forming as well. We have a stakeholder group that will be looking specifically at the land use pieces, what changes, you know, for the state program as well as local plans and codes. And Mary Kyle will be serving on that group as well as planners and community members from wildfire impacted communities around the state and other statewide groups. So I think we'll have some very robust conversations, and those meetings will be open to the public as well. So more information on our website coming soon on that.
Thanks so much, Susan. I'm so glad we were able to have you and be able to thank you, Sean, for teaching me how to promote someone to panelist. So thank you for leading the work over at our Department of Land Conservation and Development. And actually, since we have you as a panelist, and we have a lot of members interested in DLCD's focus on this, I want to share a comment that says, is there any chance, as DLCD prepares recommendations to focus on rural residential zone development, to require that to have at least primary fuel breaks? Or are you focusing at laws related to accessory structures on forest zoned lands? Any updates there? Is DLCD, are you all interested in discussing or considering certain situations where exclusive farm use zoned land may be required to have fuel breaks around the structures? So just curious on if those types of questions are, up for consideration, and what you hope to get from, I guess, what would you hope our members bring to those listening sessions that you're hosting?
I would say all of the above of those topics are on the table. Yes, we are looking at, in terms of future development, are there, site development standards that would incorporate defensible space standards? And as Mary Kyle mentioned, areas in the extreme and high hazard within the WUI. There was a mention of structures on exclusive farm use land, and the Oregon Department of Forestry RAC had many long conversations about structures and how those are defined. And that is kind of going through its public review process with the Forestry Board. So I'm not going to comment on that, but really looking at structures as defined structures over 400 square feet, I believe. But there was a lot of conversation about structures specifically for farming uses, for example, pole barns, and how they might be regulated a little differently than a place where people live. So more of those conversations coming, but some of that is being hashed out with the mapping as well.
Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. And that is a great opportunity, as we get more information, and I think really hear hopeful progress from our state agency leads in this puzzle. That serves us well here at 1,000 Friends to partner, to support this work, to bring great ideas like we're already hearing in our chat. And be able to learn from each other. We're entering new territory here. And I think we can be a shining example of how a state can have a comprehensive approach, like we had in land use in 1973.